The story begins with a girl walking along a deserted alley whose health was deteriorating every day. Clearing her throat, she noticed blood on her hand and chin, realizing that the disease was only progressing. Her life was ruined, and all because of one person, but she told herself that she was not yet ready to die so early. When she was 16, he framed her mother, and she committed suicide. The woman could not withstand this pressure, and when he turned 19, he decided to take advantage of her. Despite refusals and protests, he wanted to get her body. No matter how hard Rita tried, she could not oppose anything to a strong man who did not see any obstacles. After this incident, from an aristocrat Rita, she turned into an ordinary waitress living an ordinary life. However, from that moment on, her health began to deteriorate, and blood began to come out of her with coughing, indicating illness. Now she is 23 years old. A lung disease is tormenting her body. She doesn't have long to live. At that moment, a familiar guest arrived to see her. When they met, this noblewoman said that she would like to be in a similar situation, becoming a sick person. Smiling, she said that Rita could easily die without making any effort, and she was jealous of this. This girl's name was Bertha Alberhat, and at every meeting, Rita sincerely did not understand the meaning of her envy. She considered her a crazy woman, who often came here to humiliate and mock her. And now, wandering along the alley, Rita was breathing heavily and thinking only about the fact that she couldn't just die here. She was willing to sell her soul to the devil just to survive, and would go to any lengths to do so. After a while, she reached a dark-skinned man who calmly stated that he had one proposal. Her body, dried out by disease, and the body of a person awaiting death, he is able to do so in order to change their places. A smile immediately appeared on the face of the emaciated Rita, because that day the hatred hidden in the depths of her soul awakened. When everything was done, Rita felt sorry that Bertha could not use such a wonderful body properly. Considering that she was stupid, the girl immediately stood in front of the mirror and began to admire her new body. Touching her reflection, her expression immediately changed to disdain as she asked if she was dead. But even if she is still alive, she is probably confused and terrified, not understanding what happened. She so diligently pretended to be a victim and even tried to commit suicide several times, although unsuccessfully. But now she has given her a body in which Bertha can finally die in peace, as she wished. At that same second, the girl drew attention to her wrist, on which there were fresh wounds from cuts. They were still bleeding, so Rita decided to get the blood off. At that same second, Ian called out to her, asking if she could come in. She had not yet had time to adapt, and she did not know who he was and whether she should let him into her chambers. The butler of Alberhat County, a young guy with silver hair and a monocle, entered the room. Then he glanced at the girl, who crossed her arms over her chest, looking intently at the young guy. She noticed his disgusting look, not understanding how he dared to look at the person he served like that. Ian said that he noticed that she was in a good mood today. Bertha replied that she felt great. The guy smiled, saying that he was worried about her condition, but was glad to hear that she was full of energy again. Smiling, the girl replied that today she decided to change, then asked herself what he was thinking about. When Bertha waved her hand, the guy noticed her wrist and said loudly that my lady had hurt herself again. Taking her hand, he said that nothing could be changed. She just needed to take care of herself. Looking into her eyes, he clarified that she could not break off her engagement to Count Lawrence by hurting herself. Rita didn't know that Bertha had a fiancé, so she asked herself whether it would be better to get married than to bring herself to this point. Yang said that marriage is not only love, but also other circumstances, so the Count is an excellent partner for an alliance. Rita tried to understand why he was so sensitive about the engagement, which Bertha hated so much. She even tried to commit suicide, not understanding what other benefits marriage had, if not love. While Yang looked at the girl standing in front of him, she thought that she should just watch in silence. Smiling strangely, the butler said that it seemed like she was really going to change her mind. He then asked if he could give her a massage like before, since she should be used to it by now. Before Rita had time to answer, the guy immediately picked her up in his arms, making the girl scream. He threw her onto the bed as she tried to figure out what the situation was, deciding to just wait and see for herself. She had an excellent opportunity to learn about Bertha's real situation and understand her motives. Approaching the aristocrat, Yang asked permission, after which he began to slowly spread her thighs. Rita did not understand what was happening, while the guy said that now she feels more relaxed. Stunned, Rita did not understand what all this meant, and how Bertha could allow the butler such liberties. When it was over, Yang explained that the Lawrence family was a family with a promising political future, and he is completely sure that one day she will realize the value of this marriage, after which she herself will want to marry him. When he finished, he politely kissed her hand, asking her permission to take his leave, and then left. Rita looked after the butler in shock, mentally asking Bertha if she had really lived like this all her life. Sometime later, she decided to take a bath to relax a little after what happened. She was not the Bertha he knew, so she decided that she did not need to hide the antics of that impudent butler. But she immediately decided not to rush, because if she changed so suddenly, no one would believe a single word. Throwing her head back, she wondered out loud what else she would think about, what to do, and how to deal with this goner. Rita, before she changed her body, day after day hid the accumulated anger and resentment towards everyone around her. But now she decided to change everything, and change herself, so that from now on her life would be free and happy. Because the anger of a person who finds himself at the bottom is a meaningless waste of time that could be spent on something important. And if someone stronger is nearby, you will be crushed and will not even remember about it later. Rita enjoyed her walks for some time, after which she froze in front of the portrait of Bertha and her parents. At that second, she decided that there was no longer Rita, desperately fighting for life. Now there was only Bertha. Walking out into the living room, the girl loudly slammed the door, ordering all the maids to get ready to listen to her. At the request of the Count's daughter, the maid immediately began to show off all her dresses, of which there were a lot. Sitting on the sofa and carefully examining various designer masterpieces, Berta was unhappy. She was immediately irritated, because she did not understand why all these dresses looked so tasteless. Stretching, the girl jumped up from the sofa, after which she asked the maids which of them wrote the fastest. The maid with thick eyebrows raised her hand hesitantly, because she didn't know what awaited her after her voluntary answer. Bertha ordered her to take the paper and follow it, while writing down her every word. Approaching a certain row, Bertha sharply waved her hand, ordering this row of dresses to be thrown into the trash. The stunned maid looked at the mistress, asking if she was sure of her decision. She nodded. After that, Bertha began to carefully study some of the dresses, muttering something meaninglessly under her breath. Suddenly, she snatched a piece of paper from the maid, saying that some dresses could be changed a little. The maid wrote down that the mistress wanted a deeper neckline and lower neckline, and also remove jewelry. The shocked maid immediately picked up a piece of paper on which Bertha wrote everything down in detail. The girl couldn't believe her eyes, because these were the mistress's favorite outfits, but she wants to change them. Bertha has asked that all the dresses be made like this, and this week she is going to visit a clothing store, taking catalogs. The girl called Jana and Sona to her, because she had another task for them, so she asked them to follow her. They looked at each other with concern, after which they went to the mistress. Approaching the door, she asked to wait here. Bertha herself went into another room with a sly smile on her face, leaving the puzzled maids behind. When the door closed behind her, the girl hurried to take off her shoes, which made her steps too loud. She then began to sneak back to the door, doing it quietly so that the maids outside couldn't hear her. She put her ear to the door, confident that the maids were the most knowledgeable people in the house. When they get tired of waiting and get bored, chatter naturally begins about everything. Sona said that so much time had passed, and then asked why the young lady brought them here. Jean asked in response if she had rearranged the furniture, because Count Lawrence's son would be here next week. And it was a bad idea, because the young lady hates him. She wouldn't lift a finger for him. Satisfied with what she heard, the girl smiled, realizing that Bertha had never loved her fiancé. Jean bit her finger, saying that the groom was also not happy with my lady, but they were trying not to show it. Sona replied that he always comes with his friend, and his accompaniment is a very strange person. Jana added that the man was a knight and had a very good body, but his facial expression was very stern. Bertha tensed, trying to understand what kind of fool would take a friend with him on his way to visit his bride. Her eyes widened when she heard that Lawrence held an important position, being the right hand of Marquis Carter. The maids began to discuss out loud, as if the Marquise had a direct hand in this engagement. Now she has a chance to take revenge on the Marquis, because it was he who made the Baroness an ordinary waitress. The girl immediately blushed and smiled, mentally turning to Bertha, saying that she was delighted with her life. She did not regret that she decided to eavesdrop on the conversation of the maids, who told a lot of important information. But she was wondering what their family had done, since he decided to seduce the Baron's young widow and dishonor her. This left her no choice. But in addition, he contributed to the expulsion of her daughter from high society, and why such an influential person as Marquis Carter decided to intervene in Walker's petty dispute. But now everything is in order. Now she will know the reason. After which she asked Fraud Carter to wait a little. Bertha thought that if he ruined her life, then she should return everything to him threefold, and even more. Meanwhile, the maids continued to stand silently, looking at their nails and rubbing their eyes, waiting for their mistress. Suddenly, the door opened, causing both girls to jump in fear, not expecting Bertha's quiet appearance. With a smile on her face, the girl invited them to look at perfumes this time, asking them to get absolutely everything. Perfume is like an invisible veil. Men are very susceptible to the influence of aromas, although they do not realize it. They were fascinated by even the cheapest perfume that Rita wore while she worked at the bar day and night. But such a luxurious perfume will definitely make them go crazy. Bertha's perfume collection is very good. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, after which Ian came in, saying that her fiancé had decided to come this week. He then politely asked Milady to open the door of her heart for a lasting relationship between the two families. Having placed the bottle of perfume on the table, the girl decided to clarify whether he would again be accompanied by a friend. The guy answered satisfactorily, to which he was asked why he always comes with Baron Jacquard. After all, it seems very strange that he constantly followed him, like a devoted dog after his master. Hearing the question, the butler looked at her coldly, answering that if she had no more orders, then he would go. Bertha did not understand why he said that the groom would arrive, but did not say a word about his eternal companion. Young, Lawrence, and even this baron, who constantly accompanies the groom, are all very suspicious. A couple of days later, the girl was completely ready to meet her groom, and so she dressed up for the occasion in a black dress. Suddenly, she noticed her cuts, which began to heal little by little, but were still noticeable. This really infuriated the girl, because she didn't understand how you could leave terrible cuts on such a beautiful body. Jean turned to Bertha, saying that her fiancé and his escort had arrived. Bertha ordered to let them in. Having placed the tray on the table, the maid turned sharply towards her mistress, asking if she needed anything else. Smiling, the girl offered to send Sona to fetch the groom, and Jana would have to stay here with her. The dumbfounded and agitated maid tried to ask what this was for, since it went against the norm. Bertha did not answer, but she had a bad feeling when suddenly she noticed the closet and then opened it. There was only one mop inside, which is why the girl chuckled, looking at the maid, who understood her hint. A few minutes later, two men walked down the corridor, while the maids looked after them and discussed their beauty. They purposefully headed to the mistress's chambers. One of them was dark-haired, and the other, taller, was red-haired. When they entered the room, the first thing the groom did was smile at his beautiful bride. Bertha replied that they had not seen each other for a long time. The guy kissed her hand and said that he had not heard from her at all. Through a smile, the girl thought that he looked handsome, but you shouldn't trust his appearance alone. Next, her hand was kissed by the groom's red-haired companion, who behaved much quieter and more suspicious. Bertha thought that although he had the title of baron, she was just a pen. He had no estate to pass on to his successors. Therefore, he became a servant and an attendant. But even if so, why does the groom take him every time he comes? With a smile on her face, the girl noticed that they were together again, believing that Baron Jacquard had a lot of free time. He gave a short and affirmative answer. Bertha began to get annoyed, deciding that he was a very strong opponent. Suddenly, the smile disappeared from her face when she noticed his very strange look, which caused trembling and apprehension. Then Bertha smiled again, saying that she hoped that the treats she had prepared would please them. Sitting down on the sofa, the girl invited them to join her. On the table in front of them were various types of goodies. The two men looked at each other, nodded to each other, and then began to slowly take their places next to Bertha. To the girl's surprise, Jacquard silently sat down next to her, instead of giving way to her future husband. She tried to understand what they were going to do. A strange man was sitting next to his bride, and he was just smiling. At that same second, Bertha felt a push, realizing that she was embarrassed now, but she couldn't leave. It was too early. Jean noticed that today she was no longer so disgusted, and then asked if she could be considered to have changed her mind. The girl tried to behave politely, although she did not understand what he was talking about, so she had to answer vaguely. She replied that instead of blindly hating, she just decided to treat it as normal fun. Reading his gaze, you can understand that he has an intimate interest in her, but he is still cautious. Plus, he looks like he's annoyed. At least the groom should be in love with her beautiful body. The blushing Jean barely nodded to Jacquard, who stood up sharply and suddenly, thereby surprising Bertha. Before she knew what was happening, the man sitting next to her grabbed her hand and moved dangerously close. She tried to figure out what situation she had gotten herself into, but at that very second, the man began to passionately kiss her on the lips. Bertha loudly begged him to stop, but the knight ignored these requests, continuing to press on the girl. However, he decided to move on, pawing her more and more impudently. Unable to bear it, she pushed him away, again ordering him to stop. Jean asked how she felt when she kissed and was caressed by another man in front of her fiancé. Bertha shuddered, looking in horror at the guy, who continued to look at them with a smile and a reddened face. Wiping her lips, she mentally asked him how dare he ask about this, because she felt very disgusted. Jean added that her snow-white body, which melts under the hard onslaught of copper-colored muscles, looks beautiful. In his eyes, it looked like the devil was trying to dishonor an angel, and he enjoyed it. The girl couldn't believe her eyes. Because he's crazy. Now you can understand why Bertha hated him. Waving his hands, Jin decided to move on to the next stage, but the girl suggested that we stop there today. After all, she is still in the process of learning. The guy frowned, asking why she was ruining the fun. He then asked if Ian hadn't been relaxing her body enough all this time. Hearing this, Bertha shuddered in horror. He decided to find out if she slept with him, because he thought that he was quite a useful guy. But it seems he was mistaken. At that second, the heroine understood the true reason for Ian's disdainful attitude towards her person. Jian said he stressed that on their wedding night, she should demonstrate everything she had learned. Bertha jumped up. I understand that this is a trap set by the three of them, but now they seem to be going too far. Placing his hand on his chest, the guy said that it is very difficult when she undermines his trust with her behavior. After all, from beginning to end, you will have to again doubt every little thing she does or says. He no longer sees any point in continuing to be condescending to her, so he suggested that Jacquard begin. The knight again approached the girl, hovering over her, not even allowing her to breathe. Only a threat emanated from him. Bertha began to step back, declaring that he would not dare to do this because she would scream and call for help. However, these words did not stop the red-haired man, who approached her and began to touch her chin. He wanted to kiss her, when suddenly there was a roar, and a girl's voice demanded to immediately take his hands off her. All three of them turned their heads in shock towards the closet, from which the maid jumped out, holding a mop in her hands. Jeanne swung her hand at Jacquard, driving him away from her mistress, again asking how he dared to touch her like that. Raising the mop above her head, the girl declared that he had no right to threaten the lady in her mansion by behaving like that. Bertha was taken aback by her bravery and thought that she looked incredibly cool now. It was just an oversight that he made while sharing his opinion, after which the guy apologized. Bertha tiredly sat down on the sofa and thought that she almost got into big trouble. But this time, everything turned out okay. Jana immediately began to whine, asking if she was okay, apologizing. Something was causing her a lot of trouble. Instead of answering the questions, the girl asked to call Yang immediately. The maid nodded. And if they want to kick her out, then there will be nothing to answer, because several people witnessed her behavior. After 5 minutes, the maid returned to Bertha's chambers, saying that, as the lady had asked, she had brought the butler. The guy stood in front of the lady, asking if my lady was looking for him. The girl paused before answering. Bertha turned around abruptly, causing the butler to flinch as he noticed her rumpled appearance and the smudged lipstick on her lips. The guy bowed, answering that everything would be done, and Bertha stated that from now on, she was her personal maid. The trembling maid listened that she no longer needed to do unnecessary work and only carry out her instructions. She tried to explain that she couldn't, because she didn't have any title. Bertha knew this and asked her to leave. When the door closed behind her, the girl was left alone with the butler, with whom she wanted to talk privately. In a menacing tone, she asked if he had fun while he carried out the shameless and terrible assignment of her fiancé. Looking down, Yang replied that he did not understand what she was talking about now. He was hoping to avoid this conversation. The girl realized that she would not achieve anything from him in this way, so she began to walk towards him. With a sharp movement, she grabbed his chest and then opened his shirt, causing the buttons to fall apart. She began to caress him, demonstrating what they were doing to her, but he argued that he did not understand what they were talking about. When asked if he used the groom's name to pester her, he replied that all family unions are like that. The guy tried to hide behind the rules, but at that very second, Bertha could not stand it, loudly ordering him to close his mouth. Starting to scream, she asked him not to appear in front of her again. He replied that he could not carry out the order. He justified this topic that the one to whom he obeys is not her at all, so the butler may not listen to her. The girls didn't like this answer, so she approached him and gave Ian a resounding slap in the face. The stunned butler watched as Bertha walked past him, asking him to leave the living room. She then slowly walked to the opposite side of the room to avoid being near him. The next day, the aristocrat sat in the gazebo, enjoying tea, spending time alone. Suddenly, her gaze shifted to her hand, which still bore the mark of Jacquard's strong grip. She thought about how to deal with those freaks, deciding to ask Count Alberhat for help, but then refused. She herself chose this candidate, so he would never help her, considering it a childish whim. While Bertha was enjoying the crispy cookies and wondering what to do, a familiar voice was heard behind her. Jana was rushing towards her at full speed, hurrying to convey to her the important news that she was waiting for. When asked what happened, the maid replied that the one she spoke about the other day, the fortune-teller, had arrived to her. A smile immediately lit up the face of the girl, who asked to accompany him to the living room, also giving instructions about Ian. As she walked along the corridor, she suddenly froze and shuddered, noticing the butler walking towards her. Bertha immediately asked him what happened. The guy was confused, which is why he thought about it before answering. When the girl headed towards the door, the guy decided to ask who the person was that was waiting for her inside now. Turning her head in his direction, she smiled ambiguously and replied that she did not have to tell him this. She stated that she would tell him about everything later, when suddenly Jana came running to them and said that they were looking for Ian. Smiling again, the aristocrat said that he needed to hurry up and not make others wait for him. Jan and Jana began to move away, but at the same second, the guy turned around, noticing a sly smile on the mistress's face. His eyes widened, after which he began to wonder why she had changed so much, since she had never acted like this before. At the same time, Bertha entered the room where a mysterious figure was waiting for her, whose face was hidden by a hood. The guest immediately rose from the sofa and bowed, placing his hand on his chest and telling my lady that he was pleased to meet you. In response to this, Bertha frowned, repeating the guest's phrase, considering that it sounded very ironic on his part. Plopping down on the sofa, the girl said that she had a very disgusting character, but it could be tolerated. Then she said that there was no one here, so they could take off this terrible hood, and they would talk normally. The visitor immediately obeyed her, reaching out with his hands to the hood and revealing his dark face and green eyes. Sitting down opposite the aristocrat, the guest decided to speak first, asking Rita how she felt in her new body. She replied that it was very beautiful, and there were no problems with money, and in addition, it was bursting with good health. The girl replied that this was because the previous owner was suicidal, which means everything worked out perfectly. Bertha thanked Ruff, to which she received the answer that this was a fair deal, and there was no need for gratitude. Smiling, the hostess decided to clarify the reason why the witch decided to visit her earlier than expected. With a calm expression on her face, Ursha confirmed her guesses, saying that the real Bertha died yesterday. This news brought satisfaction to the face of the Count's daughter, who wanted to hear the details as soon as possible. Looking carefully at Bertha, Ursha decided to ask if she had forgotten about the deal they had managed to conclude. The aristocrat replied that she remembered everything perfectly, after which she asked what exactly she should do for her. The next day, Bertha was riding in a carriage, wearing a dark dress covering her body with blue lace. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, the girl closed it, declaring that she was also beautiful today. As soon as she arrived, she was greeted by a guy with green hair, who politely offered her his hand and helped her down. A few minutes later, she entered a cold room where the bodies of people who had passed away were kept. The guy began to explain that 2 days ago, Rita's lung disease worsened greatly, and she died at dawn. Bertha immediately covered her nose with a handkerchief, feeling the terrible and barely bearable smell of slow decomposition. She pretended to cry, saying that Rita was so young, and she should have visited her more often than she should have. The girl bent over her former but lifeless body, smiling, confirming that it was really her. Looking at her own body, Bertha concluded that she suffered from coughing to the end, and nothing else was destined for her. If you think about it this way, this life has been so miserable since that day 10 years ago when she was still a child. While Rita was playing the piano, she heard a man say that he needed to check the condition of the property. However, the journey from home to the border area takes 2 days, so he asked to be allowed to stay for 3 weeks. Rita's mother was embarrassed by the fact that a member of another family was in a mansion where there was no owner, only his wife and daughter. The young brunette replied that it depended on the reason for his stay, and besides, he personally knew Sir Charles Wicker. Hearing this name, the woman immediately tensed, because she understood that she could not so easily throw him out of the house. In social circles, it is common to stay at other families' mansions to build contacts with each other. The woman agreed, adding that the renovation of the mansion was a little outdated, but he could relax here. The man thanked her, politely kissing her hand, which caused embarrassment and slight trepidation on the face of the mistress of the estate. Mom was too naive for her age, so in less than 2 weeks she gave in under the pressure of Fraud Carter. As she was getting ready to go to bed, she heard stomping outside, joyfully inviting Fraud to come in quickly. But her eyes immediately widened when a man flew into the room, whose gaze did not foretell anything good. He stated that it was a great honor that she allowed him to enter. The woman was trying to find out why he was behaving this way, but she didn't wait for an answer, as the man grabbed her wrists tightly and roughly pushed her onto the bed. When the woman screamed, several men ran into the room, followed by Rita, who did not understand what was happening. The girl was horrified when she saw her mother in this position. Tears of horror immediately welled up in her eyes. Suddenly, one of the men shouted that this woman was making love to the servant, hiding it from his brother. The other man flinched and looked at Rita, saying that she might not be Wicker's daughter either. All the circumstances worked out so well for them that they and their mother were eventually kicked out of the family in less than 3 days. 10 years later, Rita began working as a waitress in a bar, and at the same moment, she began to be overcome by a terrible illness. She only thought that if she had hanged herself back then, like her mother did, then she would not have suffered now. Suddenly, she tore down a nearby notice to cough up blood. When she suddenly turned her attention to the portrait, she tried to remember where she could see a man named Ursha, who was now looking at her from the leaflet. While she was studying the advertisements, the bar owner called her over, asking where she had been chilling all this time. The girl perked up, immediately answering that she would come over now. She did not want to let the owner down, otherwise she would be kicked out. Putting the wanted poster in her pocket, Rita decided that she would need to go to the hospital after work. When she left the medical facility, she had the doctor's words in her head that she should prepare for the worst. She stood on the street with a blank look, trying to understand why it was her, and why the disease overtook her. She could not accept the fact that she was in an incurable condition, and she did not have long to live. After a while, that high-ranking lady who comes all the time came to see her in the isolation ward again. Rita didn't understand why she couldn't leave her alone when she suddenly heard approaching steps. Through the glass, she noticed Bertha, who looked wonderful, but for some reason there were tears in her eyes. The girl assessed the guest with a dissatisfied look, deciding that today she was going to anger her again with her speeches. Startled, she heard Bertha say that she envied her, because soon she would fall into a comfortable sleep without pain. The pink-haired girl could not understand what she was saying, because Bertha could live without denying herself anything. Suddenly, the girl showed Rita her cuts, and then asked if she understood why she was jealous of her. After some time, Rita stood near the tree, saying that she was crazy to say such a thing to a person dying. Then tears welled up in her eyes when she said out loud that she didn't want to die yet because she was still young. Suddenly, somewhere nearby, she heard the rumble of a carriage, which is why she decided to quietly see who was riding there. Hiding behind a tree, she noticed Archduke Van Brandt, who was the supreme judge, getting out of the carriage. Why did her eyes widen in horror when she noticed how the same fraud carter got out of the carriage after him? And now, looking at him, the emaciated girl tried to understand how and for what purpose this man ended up here. Anyone you ask will tell you that this is a social institution run by Archduke Van Brandt. He uses personal funds. His noble origin still obliges him to fulfill his duty as a nobleman. Froude said that, nevertheless, his generosity knows no bounds, because he even takes care of sick commoners. Wang replied that he was exaggerating, because the market also proposed many good ideas for improving society. Standing behind the tree, Rita drew attention to the word Marquise, remembering what people had recently whispered about. They said that 10 years ago, he had a dispute with his older sister over the right of inheritance, and in the end, he won. After the conversation, the two men stood next to the carriage while Froude wished Van a good trip. Looking at this picture, the girl unconsciously began to scratch the tree so hard that her fingers began to bleed. With cruelty in her eyes, she told herself that she must live, even if she had to sell her soul to the devil. And now, standing in the morgue, Rita sadly realized that if it weren't for Ursha, then she would be lying in this place. She slowly extended her hand to the dead girl, asking Bertha not to envy her anymore and to sleep peacefully. The morgue worker immediately pushed her away, asking her to be careful. Even though she died, the lung disease was very contagious. Bertha pulled back slightly, thinking about what she should have said about this earlier, because she didn't want to get sick again. The girl asked if there was anyone who could take her body. The guy replied that she was an orphan with no relatives. At that same second, she began to remove the ring from her finger, saying that she wanted to take care of her repose. Handing the jewelry to the worker, Bertha asked if he could cremate her corpse and give it to her. Hiding the ring, the joyful guy replied that she had a very generous heart, and he would do everything immediately. Suddenly, the guy was called out by Archduke Van Brandt, who quietly entered the room, causing him to flinch. The worker immediately asked what business he had with him, if he even went down to the morgue to personally find him. The man said nothing as his gaze moved to the girl, who stood silently to the side. Observing etiquette, Bertha lifted her dress, after which she curtsied, greeting His Highness. She concluded that he also comes here often, in response to which Van kissed her hand, reciprocating. He then began to examine the girl, his gaze briefly passing over her neckline and then back to her eyes. He shuddered, then cleared his throat, asking Bertha why she decided to come to such a place. Tears welled up in her eyes when she replied that the patient she was looking after had recently died. Covering her face with her handkerchief again, she tried to look as convincing as possible so that no one would suspect anything. The man wanted to express his condolences, but Bertha continued to say that she still couldn't believe it. Then she apologized, asking that while she was mourning the deceased, could he please leave here? Van was surprised, but replied that he hoped that as soon as she said goodbye calmly, her sadness would dissipate. Then he bowed deeply, after which he slowly walked towards the exit, fulfilling my lady's request. Bertha noticed how the man gave her one last look. He thought that she wanted him to console her. Taking one last look at the tear-stained girl, Van barely whispered that the atmosphere had changed a little. When he left the room, the girl turned to Hans with a smile, offering to continue where they left off. A couple of hours later, when Bertha returned home, the first thing she did was run to the balcony to scatter the ashes. Throwing away the urn, she said that her soul felt very easy, and now she no longer needed to worry about Rita. There is only Ursha left, who knows about her body change, but he is not the one who will so easily blab about it to anyone. But if he himself is her lifesaver, she needs to just watch him for a while. The next day, the girl sat in front of the mirror and combed her hair, humming an unobtrusive tune. She suddenly froze when she heard the three maids talking about something, and she also became interested. Why did she say that today was wonderful weather, asking if today wasn't the perfect day for a walk? Jana immediately approached the lady. Maybe there is a place she would like to visit right now. Smiling widely, Bertha replied that when a warm spring evening blows, she thinks about her friends. At that same second, she noticed that the maid's face had changed noticeably because she was a little confused. The maid immediately asked if she should send a request to visit Duke Shade's estate. Bertha looked at her questioningly, seeing the hesitation on the face of the maid, who looked away. The girl asked if her other friends would be upset if she made a request only to the Duke's family. Jana lowered her head and apologized, since, unfortunately, she did not know about her extensive friendships. Raising her eyes slightly, she said that if the lady named everyone and her friends, she would contact them. Bertha couldn't believe that the Count's daughter had only one friend, and that's why she didn't receive a single letter. The girl asked Jean to forget about it. We will simply send a request to the Duchy of Shade, receiving a response today. Continuing to comb her hair, Bertha thought that she was the daughter of his lordship Shade, the only duke in Osland. A few hours later, the girl was met by Julia, the duke's eldest daughter, whom they had not seen for a very long time. Bertha politely thanked her for the invitation, hearing that she had not heard from her recently. When they sat down opposite each other, the guest apologized, explaining that she had some business to attend to. She herself thought that she had imagined this plump girl differently. She looked more naive than she thought. However, the question arose of why Bertha avoided communicating with Julia, because she does not look dangerous. According to Jean, every time Julia asked for a meeting, Bertha made the excuse that she was very busy. A few minutes later, they moved into the garden, where a small table with tea and various treats awaited them. When asked how she was doing, Bertha replied that a patient very dear to her had died in a social institution. Julia replied that it was grief, after which she asked what she was saying about the institution that the Archduke presided over. Answering in the affirmative, the girl looked closely at her friend. Not noticing anything special about her, Julie handed her a strawberry chocolate cake, saying that she bought it from the best pastry shop in the capital. With a smile, she accepted the cake, which looked too beautiful, so it would have been a crime to refuse. Suddenly, the mistress of the estate smiled, asking how her relationship with her fiancé was going now. Bertha said that she didn't know what to answer. Julia smiled and said that she still didn't like Jean. Through her smile, the girl began to gradually understand why the previous owner of the body did not want to see her. She mentally turned to her friend, saying that if she were in my place, she would like such a pervert. Bertha continued to smile as she listened to Julie say that this was a typical situation for victims of arranged marriages. As she advised earlier, you need to talk directly to Count Alberhat about refusing the engagement. After all, this concerns her personal life, so she cannot understand why Bertha cannot firmly insist on her own. She needs to develop her skills, as she does. It is not at all difficult if you do everything with enthusiasm. Julie explained that she would no longer be able to reach her level of ball skills, but could still start learning. Then she can get a job as a civil servant. Thereby she will be able to manage her own life. Now the girl understood the reason why Bertha so vehemently avoided meeting her, because she also had no friends. Julie said that she would soon enlist in the Royal Guard, so she would be busy, but she could help her friend. Suddenly, they were distracted by a man's voice, who announced that the lovely ladies were out for a spring walk. Turning around, the girls noticed a young guy, Blaine Shade, who was the eldest son of Duke Shade. Julia glared at him with displeasure, but he did not pay attention to this. Slowly approaching them, Bertha immediately rose from her seat, holding her dress and curtsying, greeting the Duke's eldest son. While they exchanged friendly glances, Bertha noticed Julia's displeasure out of the corner of her eye. Waving his hands, the guy said that it looked like she was about to leave, so he would escort her to the main gate. The heroine happily accepted this offer, after which she smiled sweetly, saying goodbye to her friend. As they left the manor, Blaine said that her dress today was different from the ones she had worn before. Bertha accepted this compliment, answering that she had decided to change her preferences a little because spring had come. The guy said that her new style suits her, and now she looks like a beautiful blooming magnolia flower. She said that she heard that Julia would soon enlist in the Royal Guard, and he must be very worried. Blaine agreed, because his stupid sister might make a mistake accompanying the royal family. Then he smiled, looking at Bertha, that she must understand perfectly well what he meant when he spoke of his sister. A couple of minutes later, they reached the carriage. The guy politely helped the girl carefully climb inside, when suddenly he grabbed her wrist. asking her to let him know if she had any ideas to ease his worries. He then added that he would be incredibly happy about their cooperation. Bertha tried to understand the hint in his words, but suddenly she realized that it seemed that the older brother and sister were thus competing for the inheritance of the dukedom. So Julia was talking about joining the king's guard, and if she won the race, that would complicate things. Now Bertha was trying to figure out whether she should sacrifice her peace of mind to help Blaine. A few seconds later, the guy noticed that the girl had withdrawn into herself, so he asked what she was thinking about. Suddenly, a sweet smile appeared on her face, after which she replied in a gentle voice that it was nothing serious. Blaine was surprised, because before she acted like a person who was desperate for attention, now everything is different. Then, Bertha headed inside the carriage, thanking her eldest son for accompanying her, wishing her a speedy meeting. A few days later, when the sun set below the horizon, a carriage arrived at the building, with 3 people standing next to it. Blaine smiled at the figure, whose face was hidden by a hood, saying that she had arrived early. Taking off her hood, Bertha asked if he had time to finish all the preparations she mentioned earlier. The guy answered in the affirmative, after which he pointed to the carriage, offering to go and check it out together. Pulling her hood back, the girl agreed, explaining that they had a lot of issues to resolve. When the carriage began to move away from the estate, Ian was watching them, but Bertha did not notice his appearance. Blaine thought she wouldn't feel uncomfortable in such a small carriage and put on a tatty dress. Previously, he thought that she was just a stupid young lady, but now he very quickly changes his opinion about her. He then asked how she knew that there were still illegal brothels operating in their duchy. Bertha smiled, giving an ambiguous answer. Blaine realized that this girl was not telling much. Then, he decided to ask how she knew that Count Todd, the commander of the guard, was seducing minors. She replied that they say that a woman becomes more beautiful in the eyes of men if she has a couple of secrets. She remembered that Earl Todd's wife was a friend of her mother, and she was hired to them on the recommendation of the mistress of the house. A pleasant-looking man immediately invited Rita inside, since his wife had already told him everything, but suddenly he kissed her on the cheek, asking her to take care of Rabina and not to come to him at any time. A few days later, the Count finally decided to cross the line and tried to get the body of young Rita. The girl became scared, asking why he was doing this to her and desperately begging him not to do it. When she screamed, the door opened with a creak, and a young boy who noticed this picture came inside. He tried to understand what was happening. At that very second, the man pulled his hands away, while Rita continued to cry. That evening, the whole family gathered for dinner. A sad, pink-haired girl sitting next to the Count. Suddenly, her whole body trembled as she felt the man begin to stroke her thigh. Suddenly, Ruben asked Dad why he constantly touches his sister Rita, because she really doesn't like it. The girl was immediately enveloped in fear, because she was afraid that the Count might do something terrible to her in front of their eyes. Suddenly, the Count loudly slammed the table, frowning and looking displeasedly at her husband. She ordered her son to go to his room and asked Rita to do the same, so that she could talk to her husband alone. The girl was left sitting alone, not touching the food again, because now her thoughts were occupied with something else. Then she heard the door open, and a woman came in and immediately started apologizing to her. She hoped that this would not happen to her friend's daughter, but this libertine was still able to afford this. She looked at the innocent Rita, saying that she would give her compensation so that she would accept it as an apology. However, she will have to leave so as not to create even more problems. This statement caused a storm of emotions on the girl's face. The owner of the estate promised to try to find her housing, but all this could not calm Rita down. And now, when she was riding in the carriage and remembering this, her face saddened for a moment and her smile disappeared. She did not know what her life would be like now if, on the advice of the Countess, she had gone to that family and found that person. Then she realized that working in a bar was the best option for her, and there was no point in thinking about the past anymore. At that very moment, Blaine turned to her, saying with a smile on his face that it seemed they had reached the right place. Pointing to a building in front of which there were shelves of vegetables, he said that the May Peach was located here. Meanwhile, inside this building, several people tied the hands and eyes of a trembling and frightened man. He tried to find out who they were and why they were doing this. At the same time, there was a creak of the door. Some turned around. Blaine and Bertha entered the room, and the four men immediately bowed, politely greeting the newcomers. Blaine wanted to ask how this happened, and a tied-up man crawled up to him, saying that there was a greengrocer's shop here. He tried to justify himself, shouting that there was a misunderstanding, and he himself did not understand what was happening here. At that same second, they kicked him, dropping him to the floor and asking him to stop screaming, as he was creating unnecessary noise. Smiling, Blaine said that he just wanted to make him a tempting offer that he wouldn't refuse. Looking at the tied-up man, Bertha thought that he was just as degenerate, although he definitely had talent. Blaine said he knows he has a regular customer who actively exploits his dirty business. When the prisoner heard that he was talking about Count Todd, he immediately shuddered, thereby hinting that he knew him. A trembling completely engulfed the prisoner's body, making it impossible for him to find the words to give any response. Blaine said it was his fault for not making a good impression on him. They should talk it out in private. Then the guy looked at Bertha, waiting for her approval. She just smiled, after which she nodded slightly. A few minutes later, when the bound man was taken away, Bertha was left alone, inspecting the mess created. She suddenly smiled, thinking that she needed to show Earl Todd how tough life could be. A few days later, that same count wandered along the corridor with an important air, barely noticeably clearing his throat. The guy who was tied up met him and greeted him, asking him what he wanted to buy today. The slightly nervous, excited man decided not to ask directly, asking if there were any new peaches. The smiling guy with the mark on his face answered in the affirmative, after which he asked the man to follow him. When the door to the other room opened, they noticed a young blue-haired girl sitting on the bed. Seeing light in the doorway, she asked if it was her first guest, when the man looked at her and then froze. He saw Rita in her. That girl was very sweet, so she fell into his soul, and she was very similar to her. Pictures of memories immediately appeared in Todd's face, who thought that his son had interfered with him that time. Then the man sat down on the bed, saying that she was cute, after which he asked how old she was. She replied that she was 17. Stroking her hair, Todd said that she was older than he thought, but this would in no way hinder them. Taking a bottle of wine, the girl thought that she was actually 25, but she needed money, so it was worth hiding her age. Taking the glass from the girl's hands, he decided to ask what her name was. She answered uncertainly that her name was Risa. Putting the glass on the table, Todd said that it was a beautiful name, but it was time for them to gradually move towards the main thing. The man began to unbutton his shirt, but noticed that he couldn't do anything. His fingers seemed to not obey. Then, Risa realized that now was the perfect moment, after which she attacked Todd, knocking him onto the bed. She remembered Bertha giving her money, saying that she would double her reward if she cut off his dignity. With this money, she can stop working as a waitress and start living a normal life like everyone else. Therefore, the girl grabbed the knife and without any hesitation, did what she was so earnestly asked to do. The next morning, Todd woke up with a terrible headache, after which he tried to realize where he was. He only remembered that he had come to the May Peach, and then fragments of memories began to appear in his head. When full awareness of the situation dawned on him, the man shuddered and then screamed loudly. He couldn't believe that this really happened, and then called someone into the room. When the door opened, a smiling Blaine walked in, saying that the Count woke up quite early today. Todd was surprised to see Duke Shade's son, thinking that he was now at his lordship's residence. When he moved, his groin immediately began to hurt. Blaine told him that it was better for him to move less and relax. The Duke's son watched as the stunned man asked how this could happen to him. After that, the guy asked if the man knew about the May Peach. Hearing this name, Todd froze, after which he asked if my Lord Blaine were also visitors to this place. His interlocutor immediately frowned. Seeing his look, the man immediately shuddered, realizing that he had now shaken up more than he should have. Blaine said it was an illegal brothel disguised as a store that exploited girls. They learned this thanks to an anonymous letter, so they visited the place yesterday, and everything turned out to be true. While inspecting the room, they found Count Todd unconscious, with a rather serious wound in the groin area. The guy also added that, unfortunately, they could not catch the criminal, although they tried to trace him. He also explained that his injury was very serious, and they provided medical attention as quickly as possible. But the catch was that it would be difficult for him to acquire another heir, which shocked Todd. Looking at the calm guy, The man asked what he meant, and after realizing, he screamed loudly again. Bertha, who had been outside all this time, put her ear to the door, eavesdropping on their conversation. The girl frowned, mentally asking the Count to stop whining, because no one even died, although he could have. Todd asked about his family. Blaine replied that he sent them a message saying that he had been hurt in the raid. The man immediately thanked him for not telling the truth, to which the guy replied that he could not lie forever. He then smiled, saying that as he well knew, honesty was the family motto of the Shade Duchy. Bertha was shocked by his shamelessness, because at such a moment he manages to say something about honesty. Todd immediately began to beg him not to do this, and to put himself in his position. Blaine thought about it. Then, seemingly casually, he said that her younger sister would soon be enlisting in the Imperial Guard. Firmly grabbing the guy's hand, the man said that he would take care of his sister's enrollment in the Guards Corps. First, he offered her a promotion, after which he decided that he would immediately give up his place to her. Removing his hand, the guy asked, on the contrary, to reject her application and make sure that she could not get there. Blaine explained that he could never allow this small and fragile child to embark on a thorny path, and if she suddenly suffers in a fight with some killer, his soul and heart will no longer have peace. The image of Julia immediately appeared before the man's eyes, as he tried to realize that she was small and fragile. The guy repeated again that if some trouble happens to his younger sister, he will not forgive himself. Todd immediately shouted that he understood him, but he must definitely keep his secret a secret away from his family. A smile lit up his face as Blaine vowed this, telling him to rest because they would be coming for him soon. Closing the door from the outside, the guy smiled, thinking that Bertha never ceases to amaze him with her actions. Then he went to another room, where a girl in a white dress stood by the window, waiting for his arrival. She immediately curtsied, in response to which she received a bow, and, in addition, gratitude for her help. Bertha answered my lord that she was immensely glad that she was able to help him in such a delicate matter in whatever way she could. Suddenly, Blaine began to stare at the girl, receiving a questioning and uncomprehending look in response. Then he smirked, mentally asking himself if it would be too wasteful to give her to another man. Smiling, he said that if she needed his help, she could contact him at any time. Since she helped him, he will not forget to show her his sincerity. She replied that she would show it right now. Taking her by the waist and pulling her towards him, Blaine asked in a gentle voice what he could do to help her at this moment. In response to this, the girl took off her glove, showing a hand mark. The guy immediately began to ask where she got it from. Pictures of recent events immediately flashed in front of her face. Then she thought that she would repay him double. Clasping her hands, Bertha replied that her fiancé had paid her a visit, and something happened between them by chance. Blaine said that it was terrible, and that he seemed to be very strong, and then asked how he could still help her. Taking off the second glove and placing it on the back of the sofa, Bertha asked with interest if he knew Baron Jacquard. The guy was surprised that she was asking not about the groom, but about his henchman, the Baron, who was always following him around. He replied that he knew that he was one of the poems, that they could directly pass on the title to their descendants. He is also the personal guard of her fiancé, Count Lawrence, and wherever the Count is, he will be next to him. Listening to this information, Bertha smiled. I understand that everyone knows this, but he didn't say anything interesting. Blaine said that this is his cover, but in reality, the Baron owns a secret store where they sell dream gifts. If she knows how to get there, she can buy very interesting things that cannot be found in a regular store. Looking at her reaction to the above, the guy thought that Lady Bertha was no different from other girls. Blaine remembered attending one reception where there were a lot of high-ranking people, including himself. Many guests, in particular young girls, whispered that today the eldest son of Duke Shade was incomparable. Approaching them, the guy said with a smile on his face that he really hoped they were having fun. The girls were immediately glad that he addressed them, answering that they were talking about his masculinity. And now Blaine was thinking that he already had many fans, besides Bertha, although she was talking about another man. After all, she is just trying to attract his attention. When suddenly the girl asked what he knows about her fiancée Gina. This question made the guy shudder, because she did not plan to make him jealous, but only to find out everything. With a sweet smile, Bertha politely asked him to tell him honestly and in detail what he knew about her fiancé. Blaine replied that it was a little frustrating because the girl kept talking about other men and not him. Laughing innocently, Bertha asked if she should make amends to him a little in this case. Smiling, he replied that he didn't even know what to say in order to calm his jealousy of her happy fiancé. Looking at her, he wondered what she would do. Suddenly, Bertha began to slowly walk towards him. Before he had time to realize what was happening, the heroine approached him, looking carefully into his eyes. Blaine couldn't believe what he was seeing and feeling right now, while Bertha was running the tip of her nose across his face. The guy tried to understand how he could be so scared at such a moment, while the girl increased her pressure. For some time, she caressed his face and neck with her lips, making the guy melt from the pleasant sensations. When suddenly she came close to his ear and whispered to him to wake up. This made the guy shudder. Moving away from him, she said that she had paid in full for the provision of detailed and reliable information. Then the girl headed towards the exit, putting her gloves back on, simultaneously saying that she shouldn't be seen off. At this moment, the flushed Blaine was at a loss, continuing to smile awkwardly, looking at Bertha. Having opened the doors, the heroine turned her head towards the guy, said goodbye to him, and then headed away. Towards evening, standing at the window, Blaine recalled the events of the past day, in particular Bertha's unusual behavior. He was careless, which is why he fell for her trick so easily. Its action defies explanation, and this is very dangerous. Then he decided that for some time he should stay away from her, without making any attempts to get closer. Meanwhile, Bertha appeared in the living room of the Alberhat mansion, returning home after a hard day. Plopping down on the couch, she sighed. Thinking it had been a rough day, although it was refreshing at the end, Bertha fell asleep when she suddenly felt someone gently touching her head, and the aroma of herbal oil filled her nose. The girl decided that it was Jana, but at the same second she heard a man's voice, who asked if she had woken up. It was Ian who smiled, saying that she seemed tired to him, so he decided to give her a massage. The heroine was very tired and did not have the strength to answer anything, and besides, he did a very good head massage. He then stated that recently she had become close to the eldest son of the Duke of Shade. This immediately cheered up the girl. Yang said that a young lady who has a fiancé spends time with another man, and this threatens her reputation. He offered to relieve her fatigue, body size, but as soon as he touched her, Bertha pushed him away with force. Jumping up from her seat, the girl stated that she clearly told him not to appear in front of her eyes again. The butler was dissatisfied with what was happening, so he grimaced his face, saying that this was being done only for the good of the lady. He wanted to say something else, but did not have time, feeling how the girl's palm painfully touched his cheek. The blow was so strong that his monocle fell out, and Bertha said that next time he wouldn't just leave it like that. Ian reminded her that her fiancé was Count Lawrence, and hoped that she would also take into account the reputation of the Alberhat family. Bertha tried to understand what she was talking about, but the butler only bowed that he would leave her today and she could rest. The girl loudly asked what they thought of themselves, mentally asking Ian if he really believed that he was right. She then smiled evilly, declaring that he would soon change his mind and would no longer look so impudent. Some time later, Bertha stood in front of the mirror, dressed in a white sundress. Jean stood nearby, helping her get dressed. She thought that at that moment, she would take it off. Her opponent's eyes would be intoxicated by the dizzying smell. When the maid helped her put on a cape with a hood, she asked for perfume, and she handed the lady lipstick. They exchanged, after which Bertha began to apply color to her lips, telling herself that it was perfect for her plan. Then the girl headed towards the exit, called Jana after her. She was already collected, so she followed. An hour later, the two girls reached a building with a light still on inside, calling for visitors. They noticed a sign that promised to give them a good sleep. Bertha considered this a simple slogan. She then turned to the maid, asking if she had learned all the notes she gave her. Jana nodded. The maid sparkled, answering with a smile that she even remembered what she had to do after that, and asked her to trust her. Bertha was pleased, because it is not without reason that she really likes Jana. And with these thoughts, they slowly entered the room. Waiting for them inside was a young guy who was happy to see new customers, asking if he could help them with anything. While looking around the store, Berta asked if these were all the goods that were in the store's assortment, and he agreed. Suddenly, the salesman noticed the girl's bandaged wrist. causing him to subconsciously wince. Suddenly, Jean stood in front of her, displeasedly declaring that the item her mistress so needed was not here. The owner of the store immediately began to apologize, deciding to clarify what exactly they wanted to purchase. Berta smiled slightly. Suddenly, the heroine suddenly stepped forward, which is why the guy immediately became embarrassed, looking at the client in surprise. With a pleading look, Bertha said that she needed a product that would give a beautiful woman a good sleep. Looking at the girl, the guy was shocked, but she continued to clarify that she had been looking for the sleeping witch for a long time. Previously, Blaine told Bertha that this secret store sells forbidden medicinal elixirs. The girl was immediately interested in this shop, which in the future could help her fulfill her plans without difficulty. There may also be powerful hallucinogens, sleeping pills, and stimulants that fuel your stamina throughout the night. Blaine heard that there is a poison there that supposedly kills. Even though a person is sleeping, he looks like a corpse. The name of the suicide-simulating poison is Sleeping Witch. Bertha thought this name was too ironic. Suddenly, the girl grabbed the owner of the shop by the hand, again asking him to help with her request, because only he could do it. The guy was surprised by such close contact, and therefore could not refuse, asking the client to wait a little. When they left the shop, Bertha turned to Jean, asking if she had taken what they had talked about earlier. The maid sparkled, demonstrating the whistle and answering that if a dangerous situation arose, she would whistle immediately. She also assured that she would call the bodyguards waiting for her near the carriage, after which Berta left. Entering the stream of people, the girl was lost in her thoughts, asking herself whether he would take her bait or jump off. Suddenly, footsteps were heard behind her, and after that, someone called out to her. A smile immediately appeared on the hypocrite. Bertha jumped back, holding out her bandaged hand in front of her, and the man immediately smelled a pleasant aroma. He addressed her again, causing the girl to flinch, after which she was grabbed by the arm and dragged into an alley. Pressing her against the wall, Jacquard said he heard her buy the elixir, thinking it was another suicide attempt. Turning her head away from him so as not to make eye contact, Bertha replied that this had nothing to do with him. However, instead of backing down, the man extended his hand, asking him to give it to him as long as he spoke kindly. Tears immediately welled up in the girl's eyes when she decided that she would act according to her plan to the end. Jacquard began to move closer to her, saying that if she did not give him the elixir right away, he would take it by force. He then stated that she herself provoked such a situation, so she should not hold a grudge against him. When suddenly, he grabbed her by the collar of her cape, after which he sharply tore it off, giving himself a view of Bertha's cleavage. Pulling her towards him, he began to paw her again, but the girl sharply pushed him away, stutteringly asking him not to do this. However, the man only increased the pressure, pressing her against the wall, after which he began to feel her, as if searching her. Meanwhile, Jana, who was standing outside the alley, thought that it was too dark, and because of this, nothing could be seen. Bertha thought that there were many people nearby, and Jean was also nearby, so he should not go too far.